Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, the editor of PRWeek UK. Before we start, a quick note about PRWeek's measurement conference, which is returning on 18th of November in London. With the industry under as much pressure as ever to prove its value, this is a must-attend event full of great speakers and tons of useful insights. Visit prweek.co.uk/events for more. Okay, PRWeek has introduced a new series called Reputation Hits and Misses of the Week, where we ask a comms professional to analyse the best and worst reputation management of the past 7 days. This week's author joins us today. Jack Storry is head of corporate at Boldspace. Welcome, Jack. How are you? Did you enjoy writing the first hits and misses?
Yeah, no, very much so. It was very interesting sitting down on the Friday morning and looking back at everything that had happened across the week.
Absolutely. There's plenty of variety as well, so I look forward to getting stuck into it. And also with us, as usual, is Evie Barrett, Deputy News Editor. Are you well, Evie?
Yeah, all good, thanks. As you say, no shortage of crises to unpack this week, so I think we chose a good week to start.
I think so, yeah. So we're going to ask Jack to talk through each of his choices, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion about it. We may look at a certain CEO and HR lead at a certain Coldplay gig later. But first of all, let's start with the hits. You chose the Co-op. Do you want to sort of discuss a bit of the reason behind that, Jack, first of all?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Co-op has been in the headlines over the last few months, really, since a cyber attack hit their systems, and it's had a massive impact across their business. You know, we've seen in Co-op grocery stores empty shelves. We've seen reports that in some of Co-op's funeral parlours, they've had to revert to paper to try and get their business continuing. So it's been a really challenging time for the business, and understandably a lot of the focus during those opening weeks has ultimately been on getting that situation under control, trying to return the business to normality, and providing customers and other stakeholders with timely updates. And Co-op have done well at doing that throughout the process. I'd say last week, though, and the reason we chose them for a hit was really the start to move back to a more proactive form of reputation management on this issue. So Co-op Group's CEO, Shirine, went on BBC Breakfast and gave her first interview following the cyber attack. And I think what was really refreshing was how open, honest and emotive she was in that interview. She spoke really passionately about the impact that it had on colleagues, the impact that it had on Co-op members. So obviously Co-op as a business has a very different structure to a traditional retailer. You know, many of its customers are actually members of the Co-op and share in, the success of the business. So, she gave a really emotive interview, I thought, on BBC Breakfast, and did a good job of explaining what had happened, how Co-op responded and the steps they were taking moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a regular Co-op shopper, and I have noticed in recent weeks and got very frustrated at the lack of vegetables and so on. And but seriously, it is a massive crisis for them and has been. But I sort of agree. I think they have handled it pretty much as well as could be expected most of the time. And actually, the CEO was fourth in PRWeek's UK Communicators of the Year list last year. And I really think she's been very impressive generally at sort of stating the challenges faced by retailers, calling for government help and that sort of thing. And I think last week we saw more examples really in the kind of clear and empathetic comms from a business leader during, a real time of strife. So I think it was a good choice. What do you think, Evie?
Yeah, I mean, the BBC Breakfast interview really stood out to me. It did just feel like a very human response. She apologised and said it was an awful thing that had happened, which obviously you would kind of expect from a business leader, but it did feel sincere, and that she wasn't really there to push any particular messaging or narrative, that she did just kind of want to come out and speak on it. And I think that came across really authentically and hopefully will kind of resonate with customers.
Yeah, it feels like there are definitely some lessons there for anyone else hit by a crisis like this about, getting that mix of, as you say, human comms, authentic comms, but also real clarity and just telling people things as they are, which is probably a more difficult balance, I'd have thought, than it could seem on the face of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's always been, a real focus on media training CEOs within an inch of their lives and, having very clear lines to take that are often, about the organisation avoiding legal responsibility for various issues. And actually, I think, there's almost a trend in the other direction now of CEOs being more open, more empathetic in their communications. I mean, you've seen this with other cyber instances as well recently. M&S, their CEO has, taken a similar approach, actually, as an M&S customer, I've had the emails directly from the CEO explaining what's going on, giving me regular updates, telling me how M&S is, recovering from that incident. So I think, there's a real trend and also lesson for other CEOs that these incidents, cyber incidents, I'm sure every company hopes to avoid them, but it seems like they are here to stay in terms of their presence in business life. And I think there are clear lessons from both the Co-op and M&S in terms of how CEOs can respond to these incidents.
I think that's a good point. I've got a view generally that I think supermarkets in the past probably decade or so, maybe a bit longer, have really sort of managed to get quite a nuanced approach to comms generally. I think there was a time when they were expanding, before then there were, Tesco, for example, was buying lots of different businesses and so on. And it was all about the expansion and the growth. But then there've been a lot more challenges more recently, whether that's the sort of competition from online retailers, whether that's things like theft and obviously price rises and issues with suppliers and so on. So I think they've got much more empathetic and they're much more focused on local communities and so on. And I'm sure there are lots of examples where they haven't got it totally right. But I think as a sector, they're quite a good sort of comms case study, really. And I think a good choice for the first hit. So talking of things you might buy in a branch of Co-op or any other retailer.
Nice segue.
Thanks. Tell us about your second hit.
Yeah, so this is the Coca-Cola Company. And now I imagine if you're, in a communications team of a global fast-moving consumer goods brand, the thing that will strike almost fear into your heart is the words that President Trump has tweeted or posted about your brand on his Truth Social platform, which he frequently uses as his bully pulpit to communicate with businesses. And he did this last week. So he tweeted and posted on there about Coke and effectively saying that they had agreed to change the formulation of Coca-Cola to rely on cane sugar rather than corn syrup, and effectively announced this to the world. And I thought Coca-Cola did really well in terms of their response, because effectively what they did is they came back thanking the president for his support of Coca-Cola and then promising to keep customers updated on the changes. Now, I imagine that statement was relatively hastily put together. There's a clear communication challenge there. Coke were clearly not in a position, the Coca-Cola Company were not in a position where they wanted to share details of the product changes. I imagine, having worked with many organisations of this nature, that there'll be a whole load of intricacies and technicalities they'll need to work through in terms of making those product updates and getting them out to market. So clearly the president had been told something and then decided to share it with the world. Coca-Cola Company weren't ready to kind of go quite that far yet, but also there is a real need to keep the president on side. We've seen time after time again that the president, Trump, is notoriously sensitive to arguably any form of criticism, but especially when corporate leaders or corporate businesses are deemed to have stepped out of line. So there was absolutely no way the Coca-Cola Company wanted to be seen as contradicting what President Trump was saying. So I think it was really nice that they found this form of words that saw them stay on side with the president, but also buy themselves effectively a little bit of breathing space before they make a fuller announcement about how Coke may be changing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I do think it was clever comms, really. I think, as you say, sort of getting that balance between like sounding appreciative towards the president, but not looking like they're sort of toadying up to him and certainly not giving anything away. I like the way this framed his intervention as enthusiasm for Coke, as if he's a kind of a loyal customer who's just really excited about the fact that his favourite drink is going to have a new flavour and isn't it's brilliant. So they managed to build a bit of marketing hype into it as well. So, I really feel like they swerved a cultural minefield with this one. So, yeah, I agree. Thumbs up. Evie?
I completely agree too, but it does depend if Trump follows up on this request and really how enthusiastic about it he is, I guess, because they could struggle then if, as you say, there's intricacies with kind of changing the formula and that kind of thing. Interestingly, when I was researching this, I found a tweet from Trump in 2012 that read, "The Coca-Cola Company is not happy with me. That's okay. I'll still keep drinking that garbage." So I suspect that he may not be that much of a fan anyway. It's probably just a fleeting thing that he's kind of said. I mean, if they wanted to really create some drama, they could have brought that up. But
I mean, I was thinking about this, an odd comparison really with Keir Starmer. And I know Starmer gets criticised for his comms quite a lot, but I do think the way he sort of navigated this sort of minefield of dealing with Trump from a political point of view was pretty good, really, compared to, let's face it, most world leaders and most sort of senior political figures. And I think sort of Coke is the kind of Keir Starmer of the fizzy drinks world, is not a sentence you'll probably hear again on this podcast, but I'm going with it. Both red, and I've run out of comparisons there, but I'll go with it.
I think it's a good analogy. Starmer has taken that really diplomatic approach with Trump, and it's in many ways paid dividends, and Coke are copying that playbook, right? And Evie, I think your point's a really good one as well, because ultimately this taps into a policy debate in that you've got Robert Kennedy, who leads on health for Trump, who is a known passionate activist around ingredients in American foods and things like that, and corn syrup has been part of that conversation. So I think that's probably why President Trump has got involved. But equally, for Coke, it's going to be really difficult one changing the product. Those with longer memories will remember the sort of New Coke saga many years ago, where they changed the formulation of their product, and it went down awfully. And that will be at the forefront of the mind of everyone at Coke. Yes, it might seem a simple change to make, but if it changes the taste just a little bit, there'll be both people who will love that and there will be people who will hate that. So finding a way to keep all potential customers happy, I'm sure, is a line that Coke are going to be very carefully treading over the coming weeks and months.
Absolutely. Okay, so on to the misses. Yeah, well, the one you chose couldn't be further away from the likes of a multinational global drinks behemoth. Just tell us about your choice for miss.
Yes, this is the Stowe Valley Multi-Academy Trust. So for those who aren't familiar with the story, at one of their schools, they held a cultural diversity day. A young girl attended that in a Union Jack dress and asked to give a speech about British culture. She was told that wasn't appropriate and understandably was upset by that, asked to go home, was collected from school early by her father, who proceeded to then put a post up on Facebook about her experience. Over the weekend, that went absolutely viral on Facebook, X, pretty much any other social media channel. And, there was a mix of reasons why that. I think it really tapped into, some of the culture war conversations, and, arguably some of the people who were fanning the flames of this story, didn't have the most honest intentions, let's put it that way, and, may have had other political motives behind it. But fundamentally, this led to it blowing up. National media then began covering the story. Pretty much every national media outlet wrote about it, and belatedly the Multi-Academy Trust had to issue a statement. Now, to be fair to them, they got to the right place by early that week, issuing a statement that was very apologetic, that talked about how they were going to learn from it. But it was sort of a classic example of bits of the statement were right in terms of saying they wanted to learn from this, they were going to put in place new processes, new training to make sure it didn't happen again. But ultimately, the door had bolted on that, and the story had absolutely exploded. And to the point where, unfortunately, at the end of last week, the school had to close because of some of the things that were happening around the school. I think there'd been threats made to some of the staff in relation to that. So that's about the worst outcome you can have as an educational institution, that something like that has forced you to basically stop educating the hundreds of that and possibly thousands of children who attend that school. And ultimately it's one where prevention is better than the cure. You can talk about putting this training in place after the fact, but really organisations, and especially, I think this is a bit of a comment on the education landscape in the UK, really, in that you talk about how the multi-academy trusts are different to large corporates, but in many ways multi-academy trusts have moved a lot closer to corporates versus the old sort of council schooling system. Many of the multi-academy trusts now have tens and tens of schools and are building corporate reputations for themselves. As they build those corporate reputations need to be protected, and a big part of that is what you might say on your website and say in your communications otherwise, but also a big part of it is ensuring that everyone within your organisation is acting in the right way. And it only takes one small moment to catapult you into national headlines, especially something as sensitive as borderline culture war issues, which is what this turned into. So I think ultimately that's where Stowe Valley probably went wrong on this one.
Do you think they simply should have responded earlier? Do you think that would have made much difference?
I think that's part of it. I think probably they weren't set up for managing an issue like this. If you think about, again, some of the well-established corporate organisations that, probably some of the multi-academy trusts aspire to compare themselves to, they will have teams who will spot issues like this and will absolutely jump on responding to them. It seemed from the external communication that the first time Stowe Valley got involved in responding publicly was really when national media started to write about it on the Monday. So they'd kind of let really the situation snowball over the weekend. So I think they could have been quicker, but equally, I think how much damage they could have limited by responding quickly is probably open to question.
I thought it was kind of unequivocal statement. At least they didn't try to sort of say it shouldn't have happened like this, but it felt like they'd at least acknowledged that they need to be very clear with this.
I agree, yeah.
So I guess there's that, but I also agree that the sort of the timing element was not brilliant. What do you think, Evie?
I mean, it's really just a cautionary tale that it doesn't matter how much of a profile you have when it comes to culture wars and these really sensitive topics. Everyone has to be thinking about their communication and their reputation around that. It does raise the kind of wider issue about this strange lens that we view patriotism in Britain through now, and how, I think everyone at every level has to be thinking about that. As you say, not just the organisation as a whole and the communications that they put out, but every individual who is making statements on behalf of the trust.
Yeah, exactly. And I think thinking about the lessons moving on from here is also really important. We talked a little bit earlier about the Co-op Group and their CEO talking about how they'd been supporting their employees. And I think there are good lessons for Stowe Valley in terms of thinking about how they move on from this. Because yes, there'll be an aspect of they want to make sure something like this doesn't happen again, but also there's a real human impact of incidents like this. The teaching staff and other staff at the school who have felt threatened in recent days for their safety, making sure that they have the support they need from the organisation. I mean, to your point, that's a really challenging one, and the school needs to really be thinking about how they support a 12-year-old girl who ultimately has ended up in the national headlines, because it's a tricky place to be for a young person when your picture is splashed across virtually every newspaper in the country. So I think, hopefully things will quieten down for the school a little bit now. Some of the immediate media heat will blow over and they can focus on some of that really important comms bit, almost the internal comms, and make sure they are supporting everyone who needs to be supported as they kind of recover from this crisis incident.
And if they are going to have cultural days and other similar events in the future, presumably they're going to be looking at them in a very different way, and they're going to be very, very careful about how they sort of address something that ultimately we assume the person who put it together had good intentions, but it just went totally awry.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there will be a whole load of, whether it's cultural diversity days at schools or pride events, things like that, there needs to be really careful consideration from organisations about how they can effectively communicate around that, because ultimately we want to celebrate things like cultural diversity, but I think it's important to acknowledge the volatility of the opinion landscape around things like that, and know that even if you believe in your position and believe you're doing everything right, there will be people out there. Sometimes those people will be, as you mentioned earlier, potentially coming from viewpoints that are bigoted. But ultimately, those voices are still out there, and you need to know that when you communicate on issues, things like that may rise up as issues that you need to deal with. And also thinking these things through and knowing what your viewpoint is. We saw, particularly in the US, this was a trend. Arguably in Trump's America, it's being rowed back a little bit. But we saw organisation leaders being more confident in their perspectives and, being vocal on issues and standing up and supporting causes. And I think there's absolutely still a place for that, for leaders to understand on things like LGBT rights, where they want to support their employees. They absolutely should be vocal on that, but it's understanding the landscape that's happening in, and making sure you've made an informed decision to do that, and that what the landscape you're operating in is.
And to reiterate what you're saying, another really clear example actually of how easy it is to fall into the culture war storm that really most people are going to want to avoid at all costs. Particularly if you're representing an organisation like a school, an academy, the parts of the media in particular will just pick up this stuff and run with it. And it's really something to be avoided.
Yeah, exactly. It just needs really careful management because, the flip side of this is that we don't want a situation, I speak for probably most people in the country, we don't want a situation where, cultural diversity days are something that no organisation does because they're too scared that a small minority will either speak out against them or that it will become a misjudgment or happen and that will lead to national headlines and national scandal. We want to have an environment where these things can be celebrated. Making sure that organisations are getting it right is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So finally then, I wanted to touch on Coldplay Gate. I mean, how can we not? I mean, this scandal really broke around the time you filed the article, actually, so it was a little bit too late for that, but it does feel like one of the biggest stories, frankly, in the world at the moment. Whether that's a good thing or not is up to you. But for anyone who's been living in a bunker, the CEO and chief people officer at the B2B tech firm Astronomer were caught in an intimate embrace on kiss cam during a Coldplay concert in Massachusetts last Wednesday. The CEO, Andy Byron, who is married with children apparently, was shown immediately ducking down when he saw they were on camera. Chris Martin, the Coldplay singer, quipped, "Either they're having an affair or they're just very shy." To say the video on TikTok went viral a couple of days later would be a massive understatement. The company initially said nothing. A few fake statements did the rounds, including one claiming to be from Byron that ended with a Coldplay lyric, which I thought was quite funny. On Saturday, Astronomer announced that the CEO had resigned, and in a statement, the company said, "Our leaders are expected to set the standard in both conduct and accountability, and recently that standard was not met." So now the dust is sort of settling a little bit on this. How do we think Astronomer has handled the comms here? Should they have issued a statement earlier? And why is the issue being so damaging for the firm's reputation, do you think?
So I actually think Astronomer themselves have handled this about as well as they could have. There will be a bunch of internal policies that will have governed whether what was happening on that screen was or wasn't allowed. And ultimately, the organisation needed to work within that. I think they issued a holding statement on the Friday, and then, as you say, they announced the decision on the Saturday. I think really for Astronomer, they got to the best outcome, which is that clearly the CEO's position was completely untenable after that happening and after attracting so much publicity. So him departing is absolutely the right thing for the organisation. And, if I'm that organisation, I'm now thinking about how can you effectively relaunch, your reputation with a new audience? Because I think it's fair to say the majority of people who have read about this story would not have heard of Astronomer before last week. There's actually now the opportunity, particularly when they move towards a new CEO appointment, to communicate Astronomer's story in a way that wouldn't have been possible previously. They've probably got a level of reputational awareness that they would never have had. Now, at the moment, that's for all the wrong reasons, but I think the challenge for Astronomer's comms team and for the organisation as a whole is how can they, go from being known for a viral moment that they probably wouldn't want to be associated for, to people better understanding what their organisation does and the value it creates.
It's a really good point, actually. I think the fact that the comms crisis was caused by a kind of personal indiscretion not linked to the business. And okay, you could argue that the fact he was with someone who's also at the company who worked in HR is not a great look. But nevertheless, it wasn't a fundamental problem with what the company does. It means that this crisis, despite, the amount of publicity it got, is maybe easier in the short and long term to get over. And I also agree the point about the opportunity there, because you could imagine when they do get a new CEO, they're going to be briefing them on the best thing to say when inevitably the interviewers bring up the Coldplay Gate situation. And actually, you could imagine it could be handled quite well and quite deftly, and it'll make an interesting talking point, but also a way to discuss the company's plans in the future. So
yeah, I think their comms team have definitely seen that opportunity. You can kind of see it in the statement where they say, while awareness of our company may have changed overnight, our product and our work for our customers have not. So I think obviously in sort of weeks, months to come, they're not going to be able to escape being known as the Coldplay Kissgate firm, and it is a distraction from the work that they do. But ultimately, if people weren't really aware of them before, and as you say, the people involved in the scandal were no longer involved in the business, then you'd like to think that there's an opportunity for them to turn it around and turn that attention into something good. I did think that the fake statements are particularly intriguing, seeing as most people wouldn't have known who Astronomer were, because you can understand sort of a massive multinational firm everyone had heard of, that they might be kind of wanting to put disinformation out there as a joke. But I think the fact that this is an organisation that people wouldn't know about and they're still wanting to meddle, I think it kind of says quite a lot about the state of the internet these days and the danger of leaving a void and misinformation that can fill in the gap.
Totally agree. It's a really good point. I feel that the saying nature abhors a vacuum has probably never been more relevant than in these days of rampant fake news that gets around the world so quickly. Another sort of angle to this is about the brands that jumped on the story to send out these kind of humorous memes. We saw everyone from Ryanair to Paramount, Aldi to Tesla. Some people have argued that making light and publicity off the back of a very distressing personal situation oversteps a mark. I saw one comment on LinkedIn actually that encapsulates it. It said, turning someone's affair into a content strategy isn't edgy, it's exploitative. What do you think about this? Do you think it was overstepping a mark from the brands that jumped on it?
I mean, it's not personally to my taste, but I think the point about content strategy is right. Ultimately, some brands do have content strategies that are effectively all about farming engagement and clicks and visibility with certain audiences, and their tone on social media channels is always tongue-in-cheek, no matter what they do. And I think really it's for organisations to make their own choice about what their tone of voice is, what the issues they are comfortable engaging with on social media are. I think for, let's put it this way, 85-90% of businesses, they won't be wading, with humour on this. Ryanair, though, for example, have I would argue, a deliberately confrontational, humorous at times social media strategy and arguably broader communication strategy. And for a brand like that, where visibility and being front of mind for consumers who are about to book airline flights is paramount, if that aligns with your content strategy, then it may be that it is right for you to kind of wade in on, these are opportunities where it's not like Ryanair personally inserted themselves into, the life of Astronomer's CEO. This is an issue that is in the public consciousness already, and Ryanair are just jumping on them. So, probably wouldn't be something that I would necessarily do. But, for certain brands, I think it's a strategy that is now commonplace.
Yeah, I see the temptation for brands to get involved because they see everyone laughing about it and they think, we can do that too. I just think on a personal level, it's rarely funny. I think as soon as everyone starts making cheap shots and kind of making the same kind of jokes, I immediately lose interest. I think that's when it kind of, the joke's done. I do think if there's an obvious opportunity for a brand to step in, if something goes viral, sort of specifically mentioning them, then of course, have your say on that. But otherwise I just wouldn't bother. It just reminds me of that meme, the kind of how do you do fellow kids, the kind of like older people trying to get in on things that are
corporate dad dancing.
Yes, exactly. I think brands commenting on posts can be more effective because it's more kind of subtle and just kind of leaving something there. But when it's kind of a whole, they make a big show of it and try and sort of do their version of the meme, it feels kind of like, look at us, we're cool too. So I just immediately not a fan of that, really.
I think we also saw that with Rachel Reeves the other week, didn't we? Crying, after a personal incident on the front bench. And some brands did try and make hay out of that. And, instinctively, I think a lot of people felt uncomfortable about brands arguably making light of, what was obviously a really difficult situation. I think the flip side is it also is an interesting insight into the pressure that some of the brand's social media teams feel, that there's a constant need to be driving that engagement, and any moment you're not doing that is a missed opportunity. And I think that's reflective and could be some of the harsh realities about which some of those teams are judged by in terms of volumes of impressions, volumes of engagements, and getting involved in conversations where they know there are easy and cheap wins can be a really, really good way of bumping up those numbers. The flip side is, we've seen in the past some brands walk right over the line in doing that and then create further reputational issues for themselves in turn.
Sorry to say that's all the time we have for today. Thanks so much to Jack and to Evie for your great insights, and thanks to everyone for listening. Until next time, goodbye.